In module 5.4, we are introducing different approaches to integrating disaster risk reduction in curricula. And the module is mainly based on two documents developed by UNESCO and UNICEF. The first one is a mapping study of DRR integration in school curricula in 30 countries. And the second one is a very technical guiding document that leads you through a step-to-step approach of curriculum integration of DRR. The mapping study aimed at capturing key national experiences in integrating DRR in primary and secondary school curricula, identifying good practices, gaps, and also reviewing learning outcomes. It was mainly based on a meta study of curriculum documents in the different countries. You have them listed here. 5 of them are from our region, including Angola, Benin, Madagascar, Mali, and Nigeria. And here are some of the findings. The fact that disaster risk reduction has limited subject carriers in the curricula reviewed, that the scope is quite often very narrow. We are dealing with very interdisciplinary and complex topics such as climate change and disaster risk reduction, but they are dealt with in the curriculum in a very narrow, with a very narrow focus, the lack of horizontal integration and vertical integration in the curriculum, meaning across subject areas and across the different age groups, the different grades. That is often not done very systematically. The way how core and co-curricula are being connected, there's system in that sense is lacking as well. And the most problematic finding is that there are no clear learning objectives. And learning objectives should always be the first starting point of the development of a curriculum. There are different approaches to integrating DRR listed here. A textbook-driven approach, which means quite often donor-funded textbooks, for example, talk about disaster risk reduction, but this then is not necessarily followed up with the revision of the curriculum or with teacher training or assessment. Pilot project approaches, this is certainly a good start of integrating DRR in the curricula, but has then to be followed up and scaled up into something more sustainable. A centralized competency-based approach, that seems to be the most systematic approach. So starting off with the definition of competencies relevant for disaster risk reduction, and then that should be again followed by a more systematic integration of disaster risk reduction in curricula, teacher training, and assessment. Centrally developed special subject approach that is being found very rarely. The fact that there's a separate dedicated subject on disaster risk reduction. Symbiosis approach means to combine disaster risk reduction with related topics. If, for example, sustainable development is a subject area well established in a curriculum, disaster risk reduction can be well combined with that. And then as a last approach, which we see quite often, is that there are special dedicated events such as disaster risk reduction days or awareness campaigns or weeks used to create awareness and teach on the topic. Now, there are 4 stages involved in development curricula and integrating DRR in curricula. This initial planning and groundbreaking preparation phase, the preparation of the curriculum itself, the implementation of the curriculum, and then the monitoring and evaluation. So the first stage is the initial planning and ground preparation. This involves determining the needs for the curriculum, also understanding what the state of the art of DRR in the curriculum is. So you need to do conduct some baseline assessment studies, involve several stakeholders, because you have to come up with a consensus with regard to the needs and to the focus the curriculum should take, and then establishing a team that will work on that curriculum revision and establishing a schedule, and including the milestones and the deadlines would be part of that stage. Here is a list of a couple of the stakeholders that will have to be involved. Of course, the education sector, the Ministry of Education, but then also ministries that are in charge of DRR and sustainable development issues, such as the Ministry of Environment, Deployment, different authorities in charge of disaster risk management, the school and education sector stakeholders at large, such as parents and teachers associations and NGOs. So when designing a curriculum, one has to take into account that this is a very lengthy process. Countries usually review and revise their curricula in a cycle of 3 to 5 years. The development simply of a one grade curriculum can take up to a year, so planning has to be done very thoroughly and well in advance. The establishment of partnerships is very important. We mentioned that before, between the Ministry of Education, but then also related line ministries such as in the Environment, Ministry of the Environment and Disaster Risk Reduction authorities. To adopt a consultative process, that means already in the preparatory phase, all stakeholders have to be aware and consulted. And the fact that you also have to link the different geographical levels of the education system. So not only the national level ministry should be involved, but at provincial and district level education authorities and actors, including teachers, should be involved in planning. The second stage is then the preparing of the curricula. These are a couple of tasks that are involved in that stage: determining learning outcomes, selecting and sequencing the learning content to translate selected learning content into age-appropriate learning materials and learning content, to develop learning activities around, to determine the pedagogies that should be used in presenting the learning content. And again, all of that should be done in a team and very much in consultation with the different stakeholders. Very essential in developing a curriculum is the definition of the learning outcomes. The learning outcomes is what results from a consciously structured and structured process of learning. Learning outcomes then will have to be linked to student assessment, extremely important. If the learning outcomes are not assessed, usually they are not addressed by teachers, because school systems are unfortunately still very much driven by final marks and assessment. So you have to look into assessment, and also, of course, the content of the curriculum is important, but teaching methods on how to deliver the content is something that has to be designed and thought of very thoroughly. You have different levels of learning outcomes. The most obvious usually are the concrete knowledge and understanding, so the cognitive level, understanding of hazards, understanding of disasters and its implications. But as important is the development of skills, and then also the development of attitudes and dispositions. We promote really those three areas of learning as important, as being important at the same level. So the cognitive, the social emotional, and the behavioral level of learning has to be taken into account in the curriculum. You have some examples here of what is knowledge and understanding, the science behind disasters, what are hazards that lead then to disasters, what is the definition and the causes of climate change, basic safety measures, what is adaptation and mitigation, but then also what repercussions do disasters have with regard to conflict, exacerbating or triggering conflict. What does that mean in terms of human rights? What implication it has to gender equality, for example. Here are some examples of skills that comes from the OECD work around the 21st century skills. Information management would be an important skills for disaster risk reduction education. Coping, self-protection, to have systematic skills of understanding how how protection and self-protection could work, action skills, just to name some of them. Attitudes and dispositions important for disaster risk reductions include respect, altruism, compassion, responsibility, a harmony with the environment. And then often talked about is that the fact that the latest state-of-the-art development in curriculum is based on competencies. The starting point to develop a curricula is to ask yourself what are the competencies you would like to develop in students, so the competencies with regard to disaster risk reduction. Students need to know and to be able to do in a varying and complex real-life situation. For each situation, different bundles of skills, knowledge, and attitudes are needed. And those are the ones that need to be spelled out when we want to integrate DRR in a curricula, and they have to be spelled out for the different age levels. We mentioned already that assessment is important, and for sustainable development, adaptation, and DRR to become fully infused in a curriculum, we have to look also what are the most appropriate assessment methods. We talk about summative and formative assessment, so an assessment that is done by testing the skill and attitudes at the end of the process. That would be a summative assessment, and the formative assessment is a more active way of assessing learning throughout the learning process, which might be more interesting with regards to disaster risk reduction education. There are additional approaches that could be involved in the curriculum, the so-called symbiosis approach, embedding safety and resilience with various facets of quality education, or using special events to alert and raise awareness on disaster risk reduction through, for example, a special day on DRR or a special week, a week dedicated to disaster risk reduction education. Here are some examples of how disaster risk reduction can be integrated in an age-appropriate way. You see it at the very early age, from 4 to 7. It's very sort of hands-on, safe and dangerous spots in schools and communities, so you can identify in your school community and on the school campus where the dangers are if ever a hazard strikes. And then to more towards the higher age groups, to more complex, more abstract discussions on disaster risk reduction, the repercussion of disasters on gender balance and then on poverty. It is important also to ensure learning diversity, so have different pedagogies and learning approaches to discuss disaster risk reduction, on the one hand on a theoretical level, but also to integrate DRR in an experimental way, to make sure that you also talk about and address emotions that such an issue can provoke, and include very hands-on activities. You have here a nice mix of activities that can be involved in DRR teaching. So the next stage is the implementation of a curriculum, which quite often starts with a pilot phase in selected schools with selected teachers that have to be trained. After the pilot then has to be monitored and evaluated, and once it is decided to take it up in mainstream, in our case disaster risk reduction, in the curriculum, the material will have to be revised, teachers will have to be trained, both pre-service and in-service teachers, so that has to be taken into account. All the sort of formal processes to include and accept revisions in the curriculum will have to be undertaken, and then the training also of other education personnel such as principals and district officers follows. Very important, as we said, teachers' professional development in and pre-service training has to be done very systematically. A needs assessment, what do teachers know and what do they need to know in order to teach DRR in the intended manner. then that has to be comprehensively planned. There has to be aftercare, and very important for teacher education in and pre-service teacher education is to make sure that teachers can continue upscaling their skills. Teachers are very professional in that sense. They are keen to have state-of-the-art skills, and it's what helps them in that regard quite often is to develop so-called community of practices among teachers, but then also ideally with some experts from the outside that can help them. We had mentioned that before, the role of teachers is changing, especially if we bring in new topics and pedagogical approaches. Teachers are not anymore transmitters of learning, but they are facilitators of learning. They have to be open themselves to continuously learn, and learning. They have to acknowledge that learning is not only happening within the confinement of a classroom, but outside, and they therefore can use other resources such as the communities, but also experts to facilitate their own learning and the learning of their learners. And for disaster risk reduction, that's clearly a very recommendable approach. Another approach we always promote and recommend is to, again, open up schools to a larger learning community, and what we call is the whole school approach, so to involve not only the strict teaching community in the school, but expand teaching activities to the community, involve parents, involve professionals, involve other staff at the school. Some activities are listed here to integrate curricular and safe school practices and the management of the school, to dedicate, for example, focal points that then interact with actors beyond the school, authorities that are in charge of disaster risk reduction, for example, and again, the active engagement of all school stakeholders, including the community. The last stage would be monitoring and evaluation of the curriculum, and then again, thinking already of a next cycle of curriculum revision and how the content and the pedagogies could be upgraded at that stage. Monitoring involves systematic collection of data, writing of reports, and then and that is something that should not come at the later stage in the planning, but should already have been planned beforehand. So it has to be clear how data is being collected, who is responsible for the collection, the cleaning, the presentation of the data, who is responsible for writing reports. So a process that has to be planned very well. Here's some of the evaluation criteria, which are very common. Relevance would be one, is what we are teaching in disaster risk reduction, addressing the needs, particular needs of the country or the school community. The effectiveness is important, the efficiency in terms of costs and resources involved, the impact of the individual learners, but ideally even of the entire community and school community, and then the sustainability of the whole process. Does the momentum and the enthusiasm, for example, of integrating DRR in curriculum go beyond the pilot phase, for example? Here's a list of indicators. You find all of that also in the reading materials. In this case, it is the book we are using, the manual for integrating disaster risk reduction in curricula, where you find the indicators and very much in more detail spelled out whatever I have presented